Life is full of awesome what-ifs, and some not so much, like unexpected medical costs. That's why United Healthcare provides Health Protector Guard fixed indemnity insurance plans to supplement your primary plan and help manage out-of-pocket costs. Learn more at uh1.com.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. "30 years ago this month, Ivan Milat was arrested at his house in Sydney. And you probably know that name, Ivan Milat, because he's Australia's most infamous serial killer. And that is probably because he's our most prolific, by body count. Between 1989 and 1992, he murdered 7 young men and women and left their bodies in Belangolo State Forest, an hour south of his home. Luckily, we haven't had many serial killers in Australia, so the case remains a big part of our cultural identity, and I wanted to do an episode on it. But I guess there's a personal reason as well. So for years, my grandfather used to live in a place called Bowral, which is a town about 20 minutes away from Belangolo, which, like I said, was Milat's favourite forest. And it's a pretty scrappy patch of bush. It's full of all of these windy, sinuous dirt tracks, and it's really easy to get lost. It's not really a pretty place. It's a lot of regrowth forest, a few pine plantations. Yeah, like I said, it's scrappy. But I'd spent a few afternoons there just walking dogs and hanging out before one day I realized that actually this is a really notorious forest. Ivan's MO was to pick up backpackers in Sydney and offer them a lift south towards Canberra. Belangolo was en route, so he'd pull a gun on them once they were near, and then he'd drive off the highway into the bush. And then forensic evidence suggests he'd torture and kill them, and sometimes even camp the night out with their bodies. And really, it's just a death that doesn't bear thinking about. But once I realized what Belangolo was, I went there one afternoon with a bit more intent. And I found the memorial there for the victims. And you can't really find it unless you go looking for it. It's really tiny, and it's at the end of a long 4-wheel drive track, and it's buried behind a pine plantation, and honestly, it's a pretty inadequate tribute to 7 lives. And the thing that really got me was that one of the victims has a little memorial of their own. And this one, the little one, is for a 21-year-old German backpacker named Simone Schmiedel. And I guess her parents wanted her to be remembered with something personal. Like many of the others, Simone had planned to hitchhike from Sydney to Melbourne, where she was supposed to meet her mum at the airport. They were supposed to go camping together, and her mum had come over from Germany, and it was going to be this beautiful bonding experience, mother and daughter, but Simone never showed up. And after a day of waiting around Tullamarine Airport, her mum contacted the police before embarking on 6 weeks of frantic searching. And finally, without any answers, Simone's mum flew home alone. Simone's body was found decomposing in Belangolo 2 years later. And now, there I was, and I was standing in the rain looking down at Simone's little tiny memorial. It was just like a little cross, and it had a sodden teddy bear. I guess, presumably it was one of Simone's childhood toys. And it was just lying at the bottom of this cross with a glow stick just slung over the top. And it was something about these personal items that just made it feel real. Because I think true crime stories, we're just kind of saturated in them. And, I'm part of the problem. I like a true crime story just as much as the next podcaster. I mean, I'm doing one right now. But I think sometimes the whole thing just it feels sanitized. It just becomes TikTok content. But looking down at this memorial and standing in this light rain in this eerie forest, and I was by myself as well, it suddenly just all felt real. It came back to me that these were young people on the edge of their whole lives, and they were just picked off for an evening's entertainment. And I thought about what a monumental piece of shit Milat must have been. He was born in 1944, and he was the fifth of 14 children. He grew up in a dirt-floored shack in the outer Sydney suburb of Moorebank, and they were a family of Croatian immigrants, and they were really poor. Their mother was perpetually pregnant, and their father, 18 years her senior, he was often violent. And according to reports from family members, Ivan showed signs of psychopathy from a young age. These came to a head in 1971 when he was charged with raping 2 female backpackers. But the prosecution's evidence was sloppy, and Milat was acquitted. As journalist Mark Whitaker summarized in a really good book on Milat called Sins of the Brother, Milat learned 2 things. Firstly, it's amazing what a good lawyer can do. And secondly, from now on, no victim survives. In December of 1989, the first victims, for which he was later convicted, were Melbourne teenagers Deborah Everest and James Gibson, and they were hitchhiking from Sydney to Melbourne. Their skeletons were found years later with numerous stab wounds. And for Milat, this moment seems like a turning point. Between 1989 and 1992, he killed roughly every 12 months, and always targeting young travellers, and always as they thumbed rides from Sydney to Melbourne. When his victims vanished, there was often some lag before anyone noticed, and when they did, there was nothing to differentiate their disappearance from the other 38,000 people reported missing in Australia every year. Milat never taunted the police or the media like other killers, and he successfully flew under the radar. Finally, in 1992, 2 people orienteering at Belangolo found a skeleton. The following morning, police discovered a second skeleton near the first. This was missing British backpackers Caroline Clark, who was 21, and Joanne Walters, who was 22, who were last seen in Sydney 6 months earlier. One had been stabbed 15 times, while the other had died of multiple gunshot wounds. But at that point, in 1992, police were pretty determined to persuade the public that their deaths weren't the work of a serial killer. But a year later, the bodies of the 2 19-year-olds from Melbourne showed up, and then another 3 bodies, all German backpackers, were unearthed in November 93. And finally, police conceded that they were dealing with a serial killer, and the media ran with the story. It's at this point that my guest comes into the picture. Today I'm talking with a former police officer named Stuart Wilkins, who in 1993 was working in northern Sydney as a homicide detective. In the roar of media attention, the New South Wales Police assembled a specialist task force to tackle the backpacker murders, as they were being called then, and Stuart volunteered for the job. Today he's going to tell us how they caught Milat. It's an incredible story, and not just because Stuart had front row seats, but because, really, he's one of the few left to tell it. While we were researching this, I realized that actually the other senior detectives, they're pretty old these days, and most of them are battling ill health. But Stuart was in his 20s when he helped lead the investigation, and he recalls the whole thing. From the day he volunteered to the day that Ivan received 7 life sentences, 1 for each victim. So now, to tell you that story, I bring you Stuart Wilkins. Stuart, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Do you remember what you were doing when you first heard about backpackers getting murdered outside of Sydney?
I was doing a job over on the North Shore because I was in the homicide unit at the North region, so that covered the north of the state from the Harbour Bridge up to Newcastle. And, I heard about the backpacker murders. I knew what was being shown in the media, so I kept an eye on it, and I knew a couple of the detectives who were there. But then once it expanded, they were almost calling for volunteers or asking in my office. We had to send 2 cops. Who wants to go? And that was when I went, I'll go. And I think Andy Waterman came with me as well.
So my understanding is I just want to have this clear in my head, that really this media storm fueled the urgency. You guys felt like you had to put together a task force really quickly because it was on the news every night. And it was on the news every night because people walking their dogs had been finding bodies. Is that about right?
Yeah, the New South Wales Police will respond to the media no matter what. And if you don't listen at your own peril. So I'm quite sure there's quite a few senior police who have discarded the media and to their own peril. It's also, it's not good having media portray that there's a serial killer on the loose in Sydney killing people who are backpackers or hitchhikers. And in general terms, that was true. So that was actually a correct statement to make. So we needed to make sure that we had the confidence of the community that we were actually doing something about it.
So your first day that you joined this task force, do you remember the briefing? Could you sort of just set the scene for me a bit like that?
So it was about, once we all got there and we ended up at the old CIB in Sydney, there was a building, the old CIB building. It was quite chaotic, to be honest. It was less than favourable accommodation for a task force, but we just did what we had to do. So we threw desks in there and lockers and we started that process. So part of the initial stages was not always about the investigation. It was also about setting up the task force and looking about how we're going to run this. And then that the famous hotline came in and the phone were just ringing off the hook, though, just everyday information. And part of my initial role was once we started getting the information about the evidence and the exhibits found at the murder scenes, it was about chasing down those exhibits. And we found these bullet and ammunition cartridges. We found these boxes. We found these ropes. We found these ties. We found other things at the crime scenes which needed to be followed up. So that was probably the most important thing. Canvases of the area, responding to the hotline. So, whilst we were briefed every day, sometimes you're out of the office for 4 weeks and it was almost incumbent upon yourself to actually catch up with what's going on. So it wasn't like the movie scenes you'll see. There's formal briefings every morning. So there was briefings, but, they were segregated a little bit because everyone had a different role.
So I'm imagining that at the beginning you'd have had dozens of suspects, possibly more. Give me a sense of the scale of the job.
Yes, of course, there was just suspects everywhere. People going, could be this person, could be that person. This person's a gun freak. This person's been inside before for picking up hitchhikers. And I would suggest there'd be hundreds and hundreds of suspects. But then you narrow that down by just, short-term investigation going, well, that person was overseas, this person was at work through one of them. So if they were escalated to a higher level as a suspect, you would go through the process of identifying some sort of exculpatory information to show that they couldn't possibly have done the murders because they either weren't in the state or they were, as I said, at work or they were overseas or whatever. Or a lot of them, to be honest, were in jail. So they couldn't possibly have been involved in them because they were in jail. So looking for alibis. But there were a lot of suspects. There was lots and lots of them.
And tell me about how and when the Milat name first showed up on your radar.
Yep. So during the hotline process, a couple of people had actually nominated the Milat family and Ivan, but with no specific information or no specific evidence, just as a hunch.
What would they say?
He's weird. So he's a gunner and he's weird and he's aggressive.
And this was neighbours or like friends?
Not so much neighbours, but people, associates, people who know him, people who knew of the family. So the Milat name came up through that process. And then from memory, Alex Milat popped his head up. So a couple of the local detectives went to the gun club down there. And then someone from the gun club said, speak to Alex Milat because he'll have some information.
So this was Ivan Milat's brother, Alex?
Yeah. So Alex came in to make a statement about being in the Belanglo State Forest, driving past a car or two cars who went past him through the forest on one of the forest roads.
What was he doing in the park at the time?
So I think he was coming back from the gun club. I think he said a Saturday afternoon, but I'm not certain. But he drives past these cars and just describes them in intimate detail. And then he says he sees who he believes was Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters in the back of two cars bound, and they look at him as if to say, please help me, or I'm not comfortable in the back of this car. And the statement was just full of these pieces of information that, in my personal view, were completely and utterly impossible. Because if you're driving past a car, you just go past slowly. The intimate details that he had in the description were, in my view, farcical. But he spoke about the length of their hair, the colour of their clothing, and these are two cars with people in them driving past. Even the registration, whilst he didn't have the actual registration number, he threw out some numbers and some letters to say it's in and around this.
But what was happening here? Was he kind of snitching on his brother, or was he trying to throw you off?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a question we've never actually been able to answer, I don't think.
And he's potentially seeing Ivan Milat's car with these two women bound in the back, or whose car was it?
No, someone else's car. He absolutely didn't think it was Ivan's car. It was someone else's car, and it wasn't a description of Ivan's car at the time. So whether it was a strategy that he knew Ivan was involved in this, or he knew at least maybe one of the family members was involved, and it was a strategy to put us off the track, whether it was a strategy to bring more attention to the Milat family because potentially he knew that Ivan was the killer, I have no idea. And I think, to be perfectly honest, only Alex could answer that question. But we just never knew whether he was the actual, whether he was involved. Because as you know, there's always a suspicion, and people have got different theories about whether Wally was involved, whether Richard was involved, whether any of the other brothers were involved. But whether, Alex's information was, again, and I've said it many times, that, it was way too in detail, was in way too much detail. To be able to remember those details, you've either got to be an absolute genius with a photographic memory, or you're talking rubbish.
Or you were in on it in some way.
Or you had knowledge.
I mean, identifying someone's hand tattoos from a passing car is pretty much impossible.
100%. And so I think the view of the task force, whilst I don't think people disregarded the information straight up, I certainly had some skepticism about the authenticity of the information.
All right, so the net is tightening a little bit. You've got the name Milat. This guy, Alex, gives you some pretty intriguing information. I understand at the time you're also going out to Belangolo. And I'm interested in Belangolo because I've been there. I drove down there one afternoon, walked around, taking photos. But it strikes me as a kind of eerie, there's a bit of a vibe there. I don't know. Did you feel this?
Yes. It was an eerie place. It's an easy place to get lost in. So I don't know if you found that, but once you get into those trails and you start walking through the bush, it's quite easy to get lost in there, and it's not easy to get out. So, and that's why we always thought that the person who committed the murders clearly had some sort of good knowledge about the layout of the Belangolo State Forest. But it's an eerie place. I took my wife in there when we were dating, just to show her, because we were at the academy doing a course together, and to this very day, she still thinks I'm a weirdo.
Did you take her there while the murders were happening?
No, it was after the investigation had wound up. But I think the court matter was still going on at that stage.
So you took her out there like, I'm going to show you a really cool spot for a picnic. Surprise, it's Ivan Milat's dumping ground.
No, we were on our way to Barrel, to be honest, and we just took a side trip through the Belangolo State Forest. So
Yeah, but it is an eerie place.
It's an eerie place. And in particular, what happened afterwards too, once Milat was convicted, and then it was again used as a place to murder someone. So, it's unfortunately, it's got a horrible reputation. And if you mention the name or the word Belangolo State Forest, even today, it conjures up an image of death and destruction.
Did you go out to any of the crime scenes? When bodies were being found, is there a moment that sticks in your mind?
Not to be honest, not really. So I didn't. You only went into them afterwards. You saw obviously all the photos, and I I saw, and there was that distinct pattern. So you see some of the photos and you see some of the scenes where there was a half-baked attempt by Ivan to cover them up, but then again, you would clearly say that that's never going to work, Ivan, because clearly he was trying to ensure that at some stage down the track or in the future, these people would be found, because there was no real, whilst there was a vague attempt to hide them in the bush, it wasn't, to anyone's imagination or anyone's standard, it would never have worked, because it was sloppy and there were still items left there. Some of the victims were still, you could still see them, you could still see their hand, or you could still see parts of them from where he made some sort of veiled attempt to cover them over.
Can you tell me about looking at these photos? You're looking at dead humans who were just traveling Australia. These were primarily young women who were on a trip of their lives. I mean, tell me about looking at the photos. What did you see and how did it make you feel?
I suppose the most important thing you look at from a homicide investigator, and you got to set aside your emotions and your feelings, because it just doesn't work. So, I'd look at the photos and be looking at those detailed to try and see evidence, to try and feel what's happened at these crime scenes, to try and get a vision of how the actual events happened, more so than getting some emotional attachment to it or an emotional response to the photos. It's just one of those things, after spending years and years in the homicide squad and being to potentially hundreds of murder scenes, they just roll with each other, to be honest. If you get emotional about crime scene photos or crime scenes, being in the homicide squad, it's not for you.
Okay, so from an evidence standpoint, looking at these photos, tell me about some things that stuck out to you.
Obviously, the crime scene examination was the firearm information that was, ended up being critical. It ended up probably being, one of the key 3 or 4 most critical pieces of evidence. You see hundreds of shells in some of the photos. Some of the autopsy photos you look at, you can see where the damage has been caused by Ivan and where he stabbed people, where he shot people. So you look at the information in and around the crime scene, the post-mortem photos, just try and build yourself a case and you build yourself an image of what actually happened at the time.
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep the story moving. So I understand that at some point a call came through on the hotline that turned out to be pretty helpful.
Yeah. So a young fellow by the name of Paul Onions called the hotline after seeing significant media in the UK. He was an Englishman, yep. So he was an ex-naval officer. And so Paul Onions rings the hotline and says, 2 years ago, 1989, I think it was, over here on holidays, doing some travelling around the place, I was picked up hitchhiking in the Liverpool area. So Ivan had picked him up from Kashula near Liverpool and had picked him up there, and he fronted Paul and asked if he'd like a lift. If you're hitchhiking, would you like a lift? And Paul goes, yep, I'm going to Melbourne, I think it was, or Canberra, I can't remember. But anyway, he jumped in the car. Ivan seemed nice enough in that manipulative way he would be. Seemed okay, seemed happy, and Paul was happy to jump in the car with him, describes the car later on, of course. And then they have a conversation as they drive down the Hume Highway towards Bowral, and the conversation turns a bit nasty, turns a bit rogue. The chap nominates himself as Bill. My name's Bill. I work for the RTA. I think he says I'm Yugoslavian. It's Ivan, of course, yep. I'm Yugoslavian. I'm divorced. So it gives him some actual real life scenarios about Ivan, but not the name. So, and then he starts going on about Japanese in Australia, tourists in Australia, and starts getting really rogue and nasty. And that's when he pulls over. I think it was, from every 900 metres shy of the turn off to the Belanglo State Forest. And Ivan's process was the radio cuts out here. I'm going to get some cassettes from under the seat. And Paul always says, well, hang on, there's cassettes sitting in the middle console here. Use those. Didn't say that, but that's what he thought. But that's the thought process of Paul going, there's something going on here. Anyway, Ivan gets all narky, jumps out of the car, tries to get something. Paul jumps out of the car, and then, because he's starting to get concerned, And then Bill or Ivan says to him, get back in, get back in. Anyway, Paul gets back in, and then as Ivan goes under the seat, he goes a whack with this big 45 cal handgun or whatever it was. And so I'll always remember Paul was sitting in the seat and he goes, I knew, Stu, at that time, it was I either get out of this vehicle or I'm dead. And I'll never forget him saying that to me. He goes, I just thought that and so I just legged it.
He just ran into the bush.
Yep. So he just jumped out of the car and then he roared straight up the highway. So the Hume Highway there is 2 lanes either way with the medium strip down the middle or a grass verge or whatever it is in the middle. So he goes up the highway and gets across, and then Ivan comes from around the car and starts chasing him. So Ivan's chasing Paul Ungans up the Hume Highway. It's up a gradient, so it's up a hill, and then he fires a shot. And then Paul Ungans goes, I'm done. So that he actually catches up with him and then rips Paul's shirt and then moves on. And then Paul keeps going. And then I don't know what happened to Ivan there, but Paul kept going. And then Paul just goes, people were driving past. So you can imagine the panic and the chaos going through Paul Ungans' mind and being chased and shot at. And so then Paul goes, I've got to stop one of these cars. So he jumps out into the highway and then stops Joanne Berry as she's driving along in the car. So Joanne comes to a pretty strong stop.
And Joanne was just a random driver.
Just a random 2 kids, mum in the front seat.
Right.
Just driving the Trago, I think it was. And then Paul stops the car and then runs around to the side, slides the sliding door of the Trago open, and then jumps in the car and then goes, he's got a gun, get away. So it was pretty traumatic sort of information.
Okay, so Paul had called from the UK and told you this story.
A couple of days after, Joanne Berry had actually called the hotline as well. So there was some synergy between their information. So he called the hotline and then I was given the task of following him up.
Hey, we're going to stop here for a quick ad break, but we'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
If you thought the only way to get a more defined jawline with natural-looking results was through surgery, think again. Juvederm Volux XC is a non-surgical injectable gel filler that improves moderate to severe loss of jawline definition and can help you achieve natural-looking results with little downtime. Even better, this improved definition lasts up to 1 year with optimal treatment. No maintenance required. Improve jawline definition for a smooth, sculpted look with Juvederm Volux XC. For important safety information and to find a licensed specialist, visit Juvederm.com. That's JUVEDERM.com. Not for people with severe allergic reactions, allergies to lidocaine, or the proteins used in Juvederm. Common side effects include injection site redness, swelling, pain, tenderness, firmness, lumps, bumps, bruising, discoloration, or itching. There's a risk of unintentional injection into a blood vessel, which can cause vision abnormalities, blindness, stroke, temporary scabs, or scarring. Talk to a licensed specialist to find out if it's right for you.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds, and I'm here with Keith, co-star of my upcoming film, If, only in theaters May 17th. Do you want to tell people the big news? All right, I'll do it. Sign up now and you'll get unlimited for $15 a month and 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan on us. MintMobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 equivalent to $15 per month. Unlimited over 40 gigabytes per month. Face lower speeds. Videos at 480p. Active Mint customers by 531.24 get 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan. Auto renews after 6 months. Offer ends May 31st, 2024. Separate Paramount Plus registration required. Terms and conditions apply if rated PG.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Because I understand there was a bit of a backstory there. And my understanding is that Paul had actually gone to the local police station after this, given a statement, and then they'd basically bungled it. They'd lost the statement. Is that right?
Yeah, they didn't lose it. They just didn't do any follow-up. So they still had a notebook entry and some information about what had happened. But unfortunately, they left it at that. They didn't take that investigation any further.
As a regular civilian, I hear this story and I'm like, geez, you got to follow this up. This sounds like a really serious story. But, you're the cop here. So to your ears,
sure.
Had you received that statement in the 1980s, do you think you'd have followed it up?
As an investigator, you certainly would. I don't think there was an investigator allocated to the information. So whilst it wasn't great and it wasn't a good follow-up at all, it's still, we didn't have the number plate.
Yeah.
We had a false name. So the media and everyone assumed that if we'd followed up that investigation that there would have been no more killings. So that's not quite right. So, and I don't accept that. That's predicated upon us being successful in the investigation and then arresting Ivan for the kidnapping of Paul Wilkins. So whilst, there's still some information gaps in the middle to suggest that we were going to solve that and we were going to lock Ivan up and he was going to go to jail. Yeah. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Okay. So you get this information on the hotline. Did this set your alarms off? Did this sound to you like a likely lead?
Absolutely. Yep. No question about it. So, I got allocated the follow-up investigation with Paul Wilkins. So I spoke to him on the phone, very paranoid and very scared, with obviously good reason.
Why was he scared?
Oh, because he was paranoid that it was one of the Milat family that was going to come and kill him.
Okay. Yeah. He was pretty shaken by his experience.
100%. And so he was certainly shaken by it. And as obviously we eventually made arrangements for him to come to Australia and provide a statement. And he almost wouldn't get off the plane until we verified who we were and we showed him identification. And we had absolutely verification of who we were. We were New South Wales Police and this is who I am. I'm the person you've been speaking to. Here's my identification. He was very, very paranoid and so we looked after him. So the information that he had given us was worth nothing because there was no formal signed statement and no identification of Ivan. So we went through a process. Obviously, we'd been building up to this before he arrived, getting photographs, understanding what his identification was and his description. So then a bit prior to his arrival, I'd made up a photo board that had 13 photos on it with people who he described as having the Merv Hughes moustache. So I had to get 13 photos of people with Merv Hughes moustaches. Of course, 12 weren't Ivan and one was. And definitely Merv Hughes was not one of the 13 photos. So the first thing we did was, I think the next day, we might have given him a day off so he could recover from the jet lag. And then we jumped him in the car and we said, show us what, we'll take you to where you tell us. So we were really, really conscious of not leading him at all, making sure he told us everything that he had in the information and we told him nothing.
Okay.
So we jumped him in the car and then we went out to Liverpool area and he was able to identify where he had stopped to purchase the drink before jumping on. So he came in from Central Station, got off at Liverpool, walked up the hill, jumped into a news agency, bought a drink, and then when he comes out of the news agency, he runs into Ivan Milat. So he showed us where that conversation with Ivan took place, the car park where the car was parked, and we're recording all this by photograph and by notes. He showed us where the car was parked, and then he showed us where he got in the car, and then we took photographs of that area, identified it, and then he jumped back into the car, and then we drove down the Hume Highway, and then as we're driving, he's telling us about what happened and what they were talking about in the car. So we're making notes of all that, and then we get to I think about 800 or 900 metres from the turn-off to the Belanglo State Forest, and he shows us almost exactly where he believes Bill or Ivan had pulled up and where that interaction that I just spoke about took place. And then we drove back to Sydney, and then we did the identification process. So we had on video 13 photos, and we went through it. And that's when he got to photograph number 4. He went through it a couple of times, and then the next time we went through and we went to number 4, and he said, "That's him, Stu," pointing at the photograph of Ivan Milat.
So it wasn't like an in-person lineup.
No, because we couldn't possibly do the Ivan one because at that stage, whilst he may have had an inference we were looking at him, he didn't know.
Okay. So were you feeling pretty buoyed by this? This feels like a bit of a breakthrough to me.
Oh, it was critical. Like it was, the most important part of evidence for the task force up until that date. So he identified him, and then, of course, Clive is on the phone to me every 1 minute almost. So it's come on, where we go, where we're at, where we at. Like,
yeah, Clive's your boss.
Yeah, Clive's, and he's just chief superintendent at the time, or whatever he was, and he was a very commanding man, and we got on very well. But he didn't suffer fools, and he wanted his work done properly to an absolute highest level and done with absolute integrity. So to be honest, I had to push Clive back a bit and just said, let me deal with this, Clive, I'll deal with it. So we had the identification, we had the area where he was taken to, we had all that information, and we had his story. So it was about formalising that information. So that afternoon we started with a formal statement that Graham and I took. And then he was really tired and he was frustrated, and he was halfway through the statement. So he had a shocking headache. So I actually stopped the statement and I said, "You have a rest, you have the night off, and then we'll come back." Clive was going off, wasn't going off his head, but he wasn't happy. He wanted that signed statement because it was such a critical part of the evidence. But I didn't want Paul to be compromised because he was feeling crook and he was feeling jet lagged and fatigued. So I gave him the night off. We came back the next morning and we finished the statement off, and he signed the statement identifying Ivan. So,
well done. Okay. And then what happened?
So it wasn't long after that we started to strategise an arrest phase for the Paul Onions robbery kidnapping. And then, of course, it was about understanding what evidence would still be there at the houses.
Okay.
And then we were going to do the search warrants in Queensland after we'd committed the search warrants to Ivan's house. And I don't know whose strategy it was, obviously Clive's, but he decided to send Bob Benson, myself and Tony Roberts to Queensland the day before the search warrants to go and visit Alex Milat to see whether we could generate some conversation on the phone between Ivan and Alex, and to see whether Alex had any information Alex was aware of, who was responsible, whether Alex was involved in it. So we flew to Brisbane and then up to Noosa on the afternoon before the search warrant. And it was just phenomenal, again, information and evidence. We were in there. We landed at Alex's house with his wife, Jane, I think it was. And the strategy was to see if there's conversation once we leave between Alex and Ivan. But during the conversation, and it was all a little bit relaxed, for want of a better term, and with some banter over the coffee table, Alex's wife says to Bob Benson, "Do serial killers normally keep mementos of their kills?" And I'm dumbfounded, and I want to put my hand up and go, "Oh, I know the answer to this question." But Bob Benson, as cool as you like, and as a smart man, says, "Why do you ask?" So it was quite a telling conversation, and it was just beautifully said. Anyway, she pops out and she goes to the back shed and she brings out this Saliwa brand backpack that was and we knew where it was from. It had Ivan Milat's initials written on the side of it. And then we come to the conversation about where did that come from. Ivan gave it to us. It used to belong to a woman from New Zealand who's gone back to New Zealand. She didn't want it anymore, so he gave it to us. And, of course, I'm jumping because I had a bit to do with the evidence, and that Saliwa backpack was owned by Simone Smidl.
It's a German backpacker. a victim.
The German backpacker. So we've got this, again, phenomenal piece of evidence that we've got the backpack owned by one of the backpackers and Alex Milat's giving it to us. So, and just as a side issue, as we get back to the Brisbane airport, I'm carrying this, and it was a big size backpack. So they go, you've got to check it. And I go, hey, check it this. So we actually had to buy a seat for it. And so it sat next to me on the plane as we come back to Sydney. And, of course, we got it back to Sydney and clearly identified it as a backpack belonging to Simone Schmidl.
So, I mean, things are really coming together at this point. You must be feeling pretty good.
Well, this is the day before. So, Bob rang Clive to tell him, and, he was upbeat, and Rod Lynch and Bob Godden are all super upbeat. This was fantastic because it gave us the thought that he's kept mementos and he's kept stuff that he shouldn't have.
Right.
If he was really trying to get away with this.
Yes.
He's kept mementos, that typical serial killer psychopath of keeping those items for himself.
So you're thinking that if you're about to do a search on the house, raid the property, you'll find other mementos.
It certainly buoyed our view of that because it was a risk that there was nothing there. So if there was absolutely nothing there, we found nothing, we were still short of a gallop on the murders.
Yeah. Okay. Well, tell me about the raid on Milat's house.
So we flew back that night, and I drove to Goulburn at some ungodly hour and bounced back out of bed at 4 a.m. So Andy Waterman and myself went to Wally's house, and then the other investigators went to different houses, different search warrants, and I think there was up to 9 or 10 executed at the same time.
These were houses owned by other members of the Milat family?
So Ivan's house, and then Wally, Richard, and some of the others. And the first one was Ivan. Until we got access to his place, we didn't execute any of the others.
Okay.
And I know it took 3 or 4 calls from one of the negotiators, a good friend of mine, to get Ivan out of the house.
Well, could you run me through the story? What happened at Ivan's house?
So the negotiator rings and says, so I'm a negotiator from the State Protection Group, and come out.
And they've got the house circled at this point. This is a full SWAT team.
100%. So the whole perimeter's covered. So, we were worried because the fact was this is a man who's murdered 7 people at least and had a propensity to use firearms, a violent man who's a psychopath. So these things can go anyway. So we had complete and utter control of the environment. It was just a matter of getting him out of the house. And then the first phone call went answered, and then 10 minutes later he didn't come out. So another phone call, and then, of course, the banter was, I thought you were joking. I thought you were just a mate of mine. And then he didn't come out again. And then Wayne Gordon, the negotiator, said again, it's time to come out. We have you surrounded, come out with your hands in the air. And so he eventually came out, and then Wayne ended up speaking to Ivan's girlfriend at the time, and she might have convinced him or encouraged him to come out. But then he eventually came out, and then they went in. He was arrested at that time for the robbery of onions and the shooting at him. Yep. So, and that's all he was arrested for at that time. Then the rest of the search warrants were executed. And then, as history will show, there was a whole range of items found belonging to the 7 backpackers in Ivan's house, in Wally's house, and obviously we found some stuff at Alex's place. And I can't remember whether we found stuff at Richard's. But I do know that Ivan had taken a number of guns and a number of the exhibits to Wally's house, so the house that Andy Waterman and I were searching, and just found wonderful pieces of evidence. We found the second murder weapon at Wally's place, as it turns out, through ballistics investigation. I think we found the water bottle there that had Simi written on it, Simone Schmidl's nickname.
Again, the German backpacker.
And just a raft of evidence. And then, of course, in his house at Eaglevale, they found the firearm dismantled and in the wall cavities.
Damn. So he was fairly meticulous. He was keeping trinkets, he was keeping mementos, but he was fairly meticulous in spreading them out and hiding them in the walls. And, they weren't just laying on the coffee table.
But I think he thought he was smarter than the cops, and clearly and evidently he wasn't. Because whilst he'd hidden some stuff, he didn't hide others' stuff. There was stuff found in his kitchen.
Like what?
There's a photo of a Benetton top, and I'll never forget this because it was portrayed in the media a lot, with his girlfriend wearing the Benetton top owned by Caroline Clark.
He'd gifted a victim's top to his girlfriend?
Yep. Yes.
Wow, that's macabre.
Yep. So macabre, and just the sleeping bag owned by Simone Schmidl. And then we did a whole range of process. We found a whole range of evidence, and it was in the painstaking process after that of going through that evidence and absolutely identifying it and directly getting it to our victims and understanding that they had possession of it prior to them being murdered by Ivan.
Wow. Can I just also point out at this point that the fact that Ivan Milat had a girlfriend is kind of wild. Why would you hang out with that guy? What was your read on her?
Because he had a history of violence too, towards women, like a strong and long history of violence towards women. So who knows? I don't get it, and I don't know. Who knows? He might have been fantastic to her, but I just don't know. And she's faded off into the wilderness.
Did you talk to her at all, or did you have anything to do with her?
No, I didn't. I know. I know that she was still around for a little while, but then she just disappeared. And so, that was a catalyst, obviously, for finding information, finding evidence, and then the work really the work began then, to be honest. It was a painstaking process of identifying the exhibits, attributing to some of our victims, positively identifying it, and then working that out over the next 2 weeks. And then after that time, Ivan was charged with the 7 murders.
Can you tell me about the day that you finally met Ivan Milat?
Yeah, so I went back to Campbelltown Police Station after we'd finished most of the raids, and Ivan was sitting there with his solicitor, and the conversation went somewhere along the lines of, we want to interview you about the murder of 7 backpackers, and then the solicitor had a conversation with Ivan, and they didn't say how outrageous, how ridiculous. They go, well, let's see what you got first for those 7 murders.
So tell me about your read on Ivan Milat.
You don't like to use the word typical, but he liked the power. He loved the power and the control, and he still did to the day he died. He loved the control and the power. So I know that there was further task forces about different other missing people and other disappearances that Ivan was a suspect for. And then I know people have gone to interview him, and he's just cold and calculated as you like. It was an interesting phenomenon that he just loved the control, loved the notoriety, loved the attention, and he lapped it up. He just loved it. So there was no question that he got off on it. I think he was the master manipulator and just loved being in control.
I mean, so can you give me a sense of like his body language, what he looked like? When you looked in his eyes, what did you see?
Cold. He just simply cold. Yep. He's quite strong. He wasn't tall, but he was quite strong in undertaking manual labour all his life. So he was quite strong, and he looked quite fit, but very manipulative, cold, horrible man.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity with one of my mentors, Dennis O'Toole, to interview the granny killer. So he killed 7 grannies over in Melbourne 20 years before. And I almost got the same look out of both of them, very manipulative. So Dennis O'Toole was showing the granny killer, John Wayne Glover, a map of Melbourne, and there was 2 highlights on the map where the 2 bodies had been found 20 years before. And Dennis asked the granny killer where he lived, and he put his finger right between the 2 yellow dots and just had a wry look on his face. And so I don't think there's any doubt that he was responsible for those 2 murders.
Yeah.
But they had that same look and that same persona.
Did you, did he ever give you the creeps, on an emotional level, where you're just kind of like, I don't want to be around this guy?
No, not at all. I find them interesting, and I find the way they conduct themselves interesting. So I like to look and see and feel how they are reacting to the environment that they've been put in. And then again, as you know, and everyone knows, Ivan wanted to be in control of everything. He went on a hunger strike because he couldn't get something, and cut off his finger because he couldn't get something. He's just an attention-seeking psychopath that was responsible for who knows how many murders.
Yeah. I mean, he seems sort of self-disciplined in a backwards, dark kind of way.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it'd be self-discipline. It would be again a manipulator of process. So if he was that smart, he wouldn't have kept any of that stuff. He wouldn't have taken any of it.
Yeah.
So he would have just left it where it was. He more than likely, and the forensic psychologists and psychiatrists would know better than I would, but he'd be getting some sort of sexual gratification out of the murders and out of all this sort of stuff that he did.
Hey, we're going to stop here for a quick ad break, but we'll be right back with more What It Was Like. All right, so this goes to trial, and I understand that it went pretty well.
Yes, fortunately or unfortunately, I got the golden trip, so I got to go overseas with the evidence and make sure that we had it identified. So we went and visited the families in Germany. We went to Switzerland and through the UK and Scotland, travelling through to identify the information, get further statements from the families. So it was quite a long 3 or 4 weeks, whatever it was. I can't even remember now, but things like getting the sleeping bag, Simone Schmidl's sleeping bag, and we were able to identify beyond any doubt that it was hers because there was only 100 made, and we actually took the fibre and got a cutting of it and compared that to a photograph of Simone with the sleeping bag, and we could unequivocally prove that was absolutely her sleeping bag.
Okay. And how were the families doing when you met them?
As horribly sad but happy in a way that there was some resolution and that we'd gone through arresting someone, and then of course they came out for the trial, and I met all the families, wonderful people, and it's always the way, isn't it? It's just these horrible things happen to wonderful people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Not that they should happen to anyone, of course, but they're just well liked and well loved families, and just simple people who, unfortunately, their children went on the dream holiday of travelling around the world and unfortunately met this man, Ivan Milat.
I mean, so you're a dad, right? And I know that I've asked a few questions around your feelings, and you strike me as a pretty straight shooter. You sort of telling me about crime scene photos, and you try to put a bit of distance between you and the emotional sort of impact. You say you find him fascinating. I'm wondering, as a dad, you meet these families, these other dads who have lost their daughters. Did you ever sort of engage with this stuff on like just a sort of human, emotional level? Did you find yourself falling into that?
You do to some degree, but you've got to keep control. So if you do that, and I said at the beginning, if you're a homicide investigator and you get emotionally involved and stuff, and not saying people don't, but if you cross the emotional line too far, you lose control, and you got to make sure that you're keeping perspective.
Okay.
So I always wanted to try and keep it straight up and down, and sure, we're all mums and dads, and but you try and keep that completely separate.
Yeah. Okay, and how did you feel when you got the conviction? He was put away for life. Yeah,
pretty good. Yeah, I didn't think, I wasn't concerned at all. I know the trial run for a fair while, and all the evidence was tested. Paul Onions came over, gave evidence. It was fantastic, pointed out Ivan Milat in the court. I didn't have any doubt. The circumstances were so compelling that there was no other conclusion to be made, but he's guilty. And, I know he yelled and screamed his whole life he wasn't guilty because I'm not guilty, but right. You can run that line all you like, and you can tell a lie. It's a story is you tell a lie long enough, you'll actually believe it. So He told a lie long enough to actually believe he wasn't guilty, but there's no question.
So I imagine this was a pretty big case in your career. Do you look back at this with a sense of nostalgia? Was this a big, exciting period in your life, or how do you sort of think about it now?
Yeah, no, it was good. It was a great experience. So I volunteered for it, and my judgment on that decision was vindicated quite strongly because it was a fantastic 2 years. I was good, but I just rolled on. So, once most of us had moved on, I just moved on to the next investigation. I think, I can't remember, I got promoted into a drug unit and then went back to homicide and then did the black market cafe murders, which were quite, that was a tense time in life, dealing with the banditos and the rebels.
So you don't feel like Ivan Milat, that wasn't exactly like the high watermark for excitement.
Oh, it was up there, like it's up in the grand final, I'd suggest. Yeah. We travelled Australia and we ended up travelling halfway around the world. So, and just looking after Paul Onions, I was coaching, and all this stuff. I was still coaching a representative side at Manly and rugby league. So I took Paul Onions to Manly first grade training, and I was talking to Bob Fulton on the sideline, and he knew what I did and he knew what I was doing. I said, it's Paul Onions up there when he was here for the trial. Wow. And so because we were looking after him, making sure he was okay. So I took him to Manly first grade training, talking to Bozo. And
Yeah, I imagine you're a bit of a rock star amongst your friends. You're the guy who helped to bring down Ivan Milat. He's one of probably the most famous serial killer in Australian history. I imagine that at Sunday barbecues with friends, people want to hear about it.
It's quite funny. Like I've done a couple of presentations at the kids' school because it's actually on some of the learning agendas for some of the subjects that people do at school. Yeah. So I've done a couple of presentations at school, but what the funny thing is that time is a wonderful thing. If you ask some 20-year-olds who Ivan Milat is now, unless they've watched that movie, the movie from the Territory.
Wolf Creek.
Wolf Creek, that's it, yeah. So unless you've watched Wolf Creek or you've got some crime knowledge, people don't know who Ivan Milat is. So
yeah, right. And so what have you learned about really bad people by doing this? Being in the homicide squad, investigating Ivan Milat, what's the thing that's inside their head that goes wrong?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I have a really good answer to it, but there's just bad people out there. There are bad people in the world. And me and my beautiful wife now say we don't like people. So it's quite, and we live on a property and we're down the end of a cul-de-sac at the back of a national park. So we like our quietness and we like our solidarity around that privacy. So the two of us just, sometimes we go, people. So there are bad people out there, and that's an unfortunate thing. People say, you should be able to walk the streets at night. Women should be able to walk anywhere at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I 100% agree. They absolutely should be, but they never will be able to because there's bad people out there, whether it comes from mental health, drug use, personality disorders, whatever it is. There's freaking bad people out there, and they will do whatever they want to do, and they will continue to do it whilst ever society moves on.
Yeah. I think there's this argument that people who become bad, people who get into recreational homicide or sell drugs or whatever, it's because they're dealing with childhood traumas. They're misunderstood. What's your take on that?
Are they? I see the excuse used all the time in court through sentencing of I had a bad childhood, I had this issue, I had that issue, I had this issue, I had that issue. A lot of the time, a lot of that is on their acknowledgement and their say-so and by their admissions and their admissions only. So I use a bit of scepticism around treated badly as a child because almost everyone uses it as an excuse for doing bad. Very rarely do you find someone put their hand up and go, yes, I killed that person because I'm a bad bastard. And I always have been. But it's interesting and probably way too in-depth for my knowledge and intelligence. Why do people commit crimes and why do they have these issues and why, is mental health hereditary or is personality disorders hereditary and how do they develop? Is it through diet? Is it through environment? Is it through personal attributes? Who knows? Yeah. It's a complex world out there.
Yeah. So to your way of thinking, there is just an inherent darkness. Some people are bad. There's a dark thread that runs through the human species, and that's just the way it is.
100%.
Yeah.
And it's not, we've got to be careful here, it's not everyone, and it's not 80% and it's not 90%. It's probably 0.1% of the population, but they're still out there. And as I say, my wife and always say, we should be able to leave our houses unlocked and we should be able to walk the streets without any fear or favour. Well, unfortunately, that's never going to be the case. You're always going to have to lock your house because someone's going to try and break into it. And you always got to be mindful of your surroundings. One thing that I've learned in the cops in between my wife and I is we're hyper-vigilant about what happens in our environment, and in particular our personal space. So we're always not on alert, but vigilant about what's going on around me.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Stuart, I'm going to let you go. This has been fantastic, and thanks so much for talking with me, and thanks for catching Ivan Milat as well. I'm glad someone did.
No, wasn't only me. It was about 40 people who took as much credit as I ever would of that investigation. So,
well, in any case, you got him off the street. You were a part of that. For that, I'm thankful.
No worries.
I'm just going to finish with an epilogue here. Ivan Milat died in 2019 from esophagus and stomach cancer. He was 74 years old. He'd never admitted guilt for any of the murders for which he was convicted, but neither did he ever admit to any of the other suspicious disappearances from the area. Over the years, multiple detectives, journalists and authors have all plausibly connected Milat with at least 6 other murders from around Sydney, all of whom disappeared between 1971 and 1994, and whose bodies were found in nearby forests and state parks. In particular, Milat was ordered to give evidence at a 2001 inquest into disappearances in the Newcastle area of 3 female backpackers. Their names were Leanne Goodall, Robin Hickey, and Amanda Robinson, and they disappeared separately, but one after the other between 1978 and 1979. Milat was determinedly unhelpful at the inquest, and he died without ever admitting any knowledge or any wrongdoing. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify. And follow the show, please. Lean in, commit. We'll be eternally grateful. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. Evie Atkins is our intern. Our cover art is by Naomi Lee Beveridge. And this whole thing has been a Super Ill production.